They cut me out of the will. Not loudly, not cruelly, just quietly. The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and kept reading as if my absence was ordinary. As if decades of marriage could be summarized and then skipped without explanation. My children didn't look at me. My daughter-in-law reached for her phone. No one asked if I was okay. I remember thinking how strange it was that grief can feel administrative. Paperwork? Signatures. A polite room where something sacred had just been erased. They assumed I was confused. Or weak. Or too old to understand what had just happened. And for a while, I let them believe that. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that my husband had never been careless with silence. He planned for absence, for pressure, for the moment when love might turn conditional. There was something written into that will that only I understood. Something meant to protect me, not from strangers but from family. So when my children started coming back, when the tone of their voices changed, when help suddenly came with expectations, I listened, and I waited, because the moment they thought I had nothing left was the moment everything quietly shifted. So let me tell you how it actually happened. Before there was a will, there was a life. That part always gets skipped when people tell stories like this. They rush straight to the betrayal, as if the damage appeared out of nowhere, as if nothing solid ever existed before it cracked. But there was a life. A real one. Built slowly. Carefully. With intention. My husband was not a loud man. He didn't dominate rooms or announce decisions. He believed in listening first, not because he was unsure, but because he wanted to see who people became when they thought no one important was watching. I learned early in our marriage that silence was how he measured things. We met when we were both young enough to believe effort could fix anything. We struggled the way most young couples do. Money that never stretched far enough. Jobs that came and went. Plans that had to be revised more times than we liked to admit. But he was steady. Not romantic in the cinematic sense. Romantic in the way that lasts. He paid attention. He noticed patterns in people the way some men notice weather. He would say things like, "Watch what someone does when there's nothing to gain," or, "People reveal themselves when they think they're safe." At the time, I thought he was just observant. I didn't realize he was preparing. We raised our children together with a kind of quiet teamwork that doesn't photograph well but holds up over decades. He worked long hours. I filled in the gaps. We never questioned whose work mattered more, because both of us knew the answer. When the children grew older, he changed in small ways. Not colder, more thoughtful. He started asking questions that felt strange at first. What would you do if I went first? Who do you think would really look out for you? Would you know how to say no if you needed to? I laughed those questions away. Told him he was being morbid. He smiled and let it go. That's how he was. He didn't argue when he didn't need to. He stored things away instead. Ideas, observations, contingencies. When his health began to decline, it happened quietly too. No dramatic collapse, just fatigue that didn't lift. Doctor visits that ended with longer pauses. During those years, I watched people around us change. Concern turned selective. Visits became scheduled. Interest narrowed to what was necessary. My husband noticed. He didn't comment much. But at night, when the house was quiet, he would sometimes say, "This is when you learn things." "What things?" I asked once. "Who remembers you when you're inconvenient?" That sentence stayed with me. When he finally asked to meet with the lawyer, I assumed it was routine. A formality people our age are supposed to take seriously whether they want to or not. I went with him. I sat beside him in that small office with the ticking clock and the neutral walls, listening as he spoke calmly about assets, arrangements, contingencies. At one point, the lawyer looked at me and asked, "Does this reflect your wishes as well?" My husband answered before I could. "It reflects what will keep her safe." That word safe struck me then, though I didn't understand why. On the drive home, I asked him what he meant. He kept his eyes on the road. "People change when there's money involved," he said. "Sometimes they don't even realize they're changing." "And you think our children would?" I started. He shook his head gently, not disagreeing, just delaying. "I think people show you who they are when they believe you no longer have leverage." I didn't press. I trusted him. Years later, when he passed, the house felt hollow in a way I still don't have words for. Grief rearranges your sense of time. Days stretch. Nights compress. In the weeks that followed, I moved through condolences and casseroles and quiet phone calls. Everyone told me the same things. "He was a good man. You were lucky. At least you have your children." I nodded. I thanked them. I didn't yet understand how heavy that at least would become. The will reading was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I dressed carefully, not out of vanity, out of respect, for him, for the life we had built, for the assumption that decades of partnership are not erased by ink. I walked into that office believing I knew what would happen. I was wrong. But not for the reasons they thought. Because while they believed the will was a document about division, I knew it was something else entirely. It was a mirror. And it was waiting. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish. That's the kind of detail you remember when something important happens. The unimportant things fixing themselves permanently in your mind. There were 4 chairs on one side of the table and 2 on the other. I took the seat closest to the door without thinking. It felt practical, easy to leave if it became too much. My children arrived together. They were polite. Careful. My daughter-in-law hugged me lightly, the way you do when you're unsure how long the hug is supposed to last. My son nodded, kissed my cheek, then sat beside her. They didn't sit near me. That was the first shift. No one said anything about it, but I felt it immediately, like a line had been redrawn and no one thought to explain it. The lawyer cleared his throat. He spoke in that neutral, professional tone that smooths sharp things into manageable shapes. He started with routine language. Dates. Legal phrases. Things that sound important, but don't carry weight until later. I folded my hands in my lap and listened. When my husband's name was spoken, my chest tightened. Not dramatically. Just enough to remind me I was still grieving, even if I had learned how to do it quietly. The lawyer moved methodically through the document. Assets. Accounts. Property. I waited for the part that felt obvious, the part that didn't need explanation. It didn't come. Instead, I heard my children's names. Clear, certain, uninterrupted. Each section ended neatly, like a sentence with proper punctuation. I felt my body lean forward slightly, without my permission. Surely this was out of order. Surely he was working towards something. Then there was a pause, a small one, the kind people mistake for breathing room. The lawyer glanced down at the paper again and continued. I wasn't mentioned. Not as a beneficiary, not as a holder, not even as a reference point. It was as if I had been erased from the narrative of the life I had lived. The lawyer didn't look up when he finished that section. He simply turned the page. My daughter-in-law shifted in her seat. The faint sound of fabric moving against leather filled the room. She reached for her phone, then stopped herself. My son stared straight ahead. No one looked at me. That was when I understood something important. This wasn't a mistake. Mistakes cause reactions. This caused silence. I waited for confusion, for someone to interrupt, for a question to be asked on my behalf. Nothing came. The lawyer eventually glanced at me, briefly, the way professionals do when they're checking for distress they aren't responsible for managing. "Do you have any questions?" he asked. I opened my mouth, closed it again. In that moment, something my husband once said surfaced quietly in my mind. Watch who speaks when things become uncomfortable. I shook my head. No, I said. My voice surprised me. It was steady, almost calm. The lawyer nodded and continued explaining procedural steps, timelines, documentation, next actions. I listened, but my attention had shifted inward. I was not angry. Not yet. I was aware of how easily people accept new arrangements when they benefit from them. Aware of how quickly decades can be reframed as background. When the meeting ended, everyone stood at once. My daughter-in-law smiled politely and said, "We should get going. We have another appointment." Another appointment. Life moving forward. My son finally looked at me then. "Are you okay?" he asked. The question came too late. "I'm fine," I said. And that was true. In the way truth sometimes arrives before emotion catches up. They left together. I stayed seated for a moment longer, watching the empty chairs across from me. The lawyer gathered his papers. "If you think of any questions later," he said gently, "you can call my office." "I won't need to," I replied. He paused, just slightly. Something passed across his face. Uncertainty, perhaps. Or curiosity. But he didn't ask. When I stepped outside, the air felt colder than I expected. I stood there for a moment on the sidewalk, watching cars pass. People moving with purpose. Lives intact and uninterrupted. It struck me then how invisible transitions are to everyone except the person standing inside them. They believed the will had settled things, that power had shifted, that I had been reduced to circumstance. What they didn't realize, what they couldn't, was that my husband had never believed in settling anything permanently. He believed in timing. And timing, I knew, was still on my side. Change doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a speech or a confession. It slips in quietly, dressed as practicality, pretending to be concern. The first sign came 3 days after the will reading. My daughter-in-law called. That alone was unusual. She'd always preferred texting, short and efficient, the way people do when they don't want to invite conversation. Her voice sounded warm, almost cheerful. "Hi," she said. "I just wanted to check in, see how you're doing." I thanked her, told her I was managing. She paused, then said, "We've been talking, and we think it might be a good idea to start planning, for the future." The future. That word had shifted meanings overnight. "I'm listening," I said. "Well," she continued, carefully, "now that things are settled, we just want to make sure everything's organized. For your sake. For my sake." She suggested things gently at first. Maybe I didn't need such a big house anymore. Maybe downsizing would reduce stress. Maybe it was time to, quote, simplify. I agreed with her on all of it. Not because I felt cornered, but because I wanted to hear how far she would go if I didn't resist. The calls became more frequent. My son started stopping by unannounced again, like he used to. But something in his posture had changed. He walked through the house as if measuring it, counting rooms, assessing usefulness. He'd say things like, "This place costs a lot to maintain," or, "You don't really use the upstairs anymore, right?" Observations framed as concern. One afternoon, he mentioned the will. Casually, as if it were settled law. "Dad probably thought this was the cleanest way," he said. "Less complicated." I nodded. "Probably," I replied. He looked relieved. That told me something. They needed my agreement more than they needed my understanding. The daughter-in-law brought paperwork one evening. Not legal documents. Not yet. Just information. Pamphlets about retirement communities. Notes about power of attorney. A list she'd printed out titled, "Things to Consider." She laid them out on my kitchen table like options. "I don't want you to feel overwhelmed," she said. "We just want to help." I thanked her again. I didn't sign anything, I didn't argue, I didn't remind them that I was still capable of managing my own life. Because my husband had taught me something valuable. People reveal their intentions when they think resistance is unnecessary. And they were getting comfortable. Too comfortable. The shift in tone became more obvious when money entered the conversation. They started referring to expenses differently. Since the inheritance will be tied up for a while, until things are fully transferred, it might make sense for us to manage some of this. They spoke as if what they'd received already belonged to them, as if I were a temporary complication. I watched carefully. I noticed how decisions were discussed without me, then presented as conclusions, how my preferences were acknowledged and then overridden politely. And through it all, I said very little. Grief is often mistaken for weakness, age for confusion, silence for consent. They mistook all three. At night, alone in my bedroom, I sometimes thought of my husband. Not with anger, with clarity. I remembered how deliberate he had been, how often he'd paused before acting, waiting for people to show him who they really were. I understood now why he'd asked those strange questions years ago, why he'd wanted to know if I could say no, because saying no isn't loud, it's patient, and patience, when paired with truth, becomes power. They believed the will had decided things. They believed the future was already written. They didn't know they were walking straight into the part my husband had prepared me for, the part where silence stops being absence and becomes leverage. There's a point where concern stops sounding like concern. It doesn't change all at once, it just tightens. That's what happened next. The help they offered began to arrive, already tied. My son suggested handling my bills just for now. My daughter-in-law talked about putting certain things in writing so everyone would feel secure. Secure. That word kept coming up, as if security were something they were offering me, not something they were slowly taking control of. I noticed how often they used we. We think this would be best. We've talked it through. We don't want you worrying. They spoke like a united front. I was no longer part of the conversation. I was the subject of it. One afternoon, my daughter-in-law arrived with a folder. She set it on the table between us, neatly organized, color-coded tabs marking each section. She smiled as she opened it, like someone presenting a solution. "It's nothing serious," she said quickly. "Just some paperwork to make things easier." I didn't reach for it. I waited. She explained each page carefully, the way people do when they think the listener might not fully understand. A limited power of attorney, a contingency plan, a provision for decision-making support. Support. Everything was framed as temporary. Everything was framed as kindness. But kindness doesn't rush you. Kindness doesn't arrive with deadlines. "We just don't want things to get complicated later," she said. Later. That was the real issue. They were planning around a future that no longer included my independence. I told her I needed time to think. Her smile faltered, just slightly. "Well," she said, "we were hoping to get this done sooner rather than later." There it was, the pressure. I asked her why. She hesitated, then said, "Because things can get messy if they're not handled early." Messy for whom, I wondered. That evening, my son called. He sounded tense. "She's just trying to help," he said. "You know that, right?" "I do," I replied. That wasn't a lie. I knew exactly how she was trying to help. "Then why won't you sign?" he asked. Because this was no longer about assistance. It was about authority. I told him I wasn't ready. He sighed. The same sigh he used as a teenager when he thought rules were unnecessary. "I just don't want this to turn into a problem," he said. That sentence confirmed everything. I had already become the problem. That night, I went into the bedroom and opened the small box I hadn't touched since my husband passed. Inside were letters, documents, and one envelope sealed separately. I sat on the edge of the bed and held it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single page. My husband's handwriting neat and deliberate. He had written it years earlier. Not as an explanation. As a reminder. It outlined the clause he had added quietly, carefully, without drawing attention to it. A safeguard. If I were ever pressured, coerced, or removed from control under the pretense of help, if decisions about my life were made without my consent, then authority would shift, not to the children, back to me. Assets frozen, control recentered, access revoked until I chose otherwise. It wasn't revenge, it was protection. He had known. He had trusted me to recognize the moment when kindness stopped being kind. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the box. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Because now I knew something they didn't. And more importantly, I knew when to use it. The next morning, my daughter-in-law texted, "Just checking in. Did you get a chance to look over the documents?" I stared at the message for a long moment. Then I typed back, "I've been thinking." And for the first time since the will reading, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about timing. There is a particular kind of relief people feel when they think resistance has ended. It shows in their posture. Their voices soften. Their patience disappears. That's what I saw when I told them I would consider signing. Not agree, not commit, just consider. The tension drained from my son almost immediately. He smiled in a way I hadn't seen in years. The smile he used when things were going his way, and he didn't feel the need to argue. My daughter-in-law became efficient again. She sent follow-up messages with timelines, suggested dates, used phrases like next steps and moving forward. I let time pass. I asked questions that sounded naive. What does this part mean? Why is that necessary? Would this change anything right now? They answered patiently, at first, then faster, then with irritation tucked carefully behind politeness. They assumed my questions were fear. They didn't recognize curiosity. One afternoon, they sat across from me at my kitchen table again, the folder back between us. My daughter-in-law pointed to a line. "This just allows us to step in if you're ever unable to make decisions," she said. "Who decides that?" I asked. She blinked. "Well, it would be us." "Based on what?" I continued. She smiled tightly. "Mom," my son said, "this is standard. You're overthinking it." Overthinking. That word is often used when someone doesn't like where questions are leading. I nodded and changed the subject. I told them I was tired. I thanked them for their concern. They left satisfied. After that, the small slips began. Comments said too openly. Assumptions voiced too early. They discussed plans in front of me as if I weren't part of them. When we sell the house, once everything's consolidated, it'll be easier when Mom's not managing things herself. I listened. I stored every word. My husband used to say that people tell the truth when they stop guarding it. The moment came quietly. My daughter-in-law sent an email, accidentally including me on a message meant for someone else, a financial advisor. The subject line read, "Next phase after authority transfer." I read it once, then again. There it was. Language stripped of pretense. No concern, no softness, just control. I didn't respond. I didn't confront. I waited. 2 days later, they arrived with the folder again. "We just want to get this done," my son said, impatience now visible. "This shouldn't be so hard." I looked at them both, really looked. At the confidence in their faces, the certainty, the assumption that I had already surrendered. I agree, I said. They both relaxed at once. I think it's time we involve the lawyer, I added. My daughter-in-law smiled broadly. That's a great idea. It was, just not for the reason she thought. Because involving the lawyer was exactly what my husband had planned for. The clause required a formal trigger, and pressure, documented, witnessed pressure, was enough. I stood up slowly. I'll make the call, I said. That night, alone again, I slept better than I had in months. Not because things were resolved, but because they were finally aligned. The silence I had carried wasn't weakness anymore. It was proof. We returned to the lawyer's office on a Friday morning. The same room, the same chairs, the same ticking clock. But nothing else was the same. My son walked in confidently this time, already discussing timelines. My daughter-in-law carried the folder like a finished task, something she expected to check off her list before lunch. I sat quietly. The lawyer greeted us, polite and professional. He nodded to me first. That was new. We sat. My daughter-in-law slid the documents across the table. We just need to finalize authority, she said, so everything can proceed smoothly. The lawyer looked at the paperwork, then at me. Before we proceed, he said, I need to ask a few questions. She stiffened slightly. He turned to me. Have you felt pressured to transfer control of your affairs? The room went still. My son laughed nervously. No, nothing like that. The lawyer held up a hand. I'm asking her. I didn't rush my answer. I thought of the calls, the timelines, the email, the assumptions. Yes, I said calmly. I have. My daughter-in-law opened her mouth. The lawyer raised his hand again. Thank you, he said. He reached for a different file, thicker, older. This isn't the first time this question has been anticipated, he continued. Your husband was very clear about this. He adjusted his glasses and read. Any attempt to remove, restrict, or override my wife's autonomy under the guise of assistance shall activate a protective reversion clause. My son frowned. What does that mean? He asked. The lawyer kept reading. It means that all assets placed in trust are frozen. Authority is revoked. Any assumed control is invalidated until my wife explicitly designates otherwise. My daughter-in-law's face lost its color. That doesn't make sense, she said. We were named. You were named, the lawyer interrupted, conditionally. He looked at me again. Would you like to activate the clause? I felt the weight of the moment. Not power. Responsibility. Yes, I said. The pen moved across the paper. Just ink, just signatures, no raised voices, no accusations. The room felt smaller somehow, as if certainty had drained out of it. My son stared at the table. My daughter-in-law gathered the folder slowly, as if hoping something inside it might change if she looked long enough. So what happens now? She asked. The lawyer answered evenly. Now your mother retains full authority. Any future involvement will require her consent. Silence filled the room. They had come expecting control. They left with none. Outside, my son finally spoke. You planned this, he said. I looked at him. No, I replied. Your father did. That was the last thing I said. Power doesn't leave with noise. It leaves with absence. That was what followed. The phone stopped ringing. Not all at once, but noticeably. The calls that had once arrived with urgency now came late, cautious, almost formal. Messages were shorter. Visits became, quote, busy schedules, and we'll check in soon. I didn't chase them. That was another thing my husband had understood. When people pull away after losing leverage, they were never holding you, only the advantage. My son came by one afternoon, alone. He stood in the doorway instead of sitting down. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I waited. You could have just talked to us," he continued. I studied his face, not with anger, but with a kind of distant familiarity, like looking at someone you once knew very well. "I did talk," I said quietly. "You just weren't listening." He didn't respond. Instead, he nodded once, as if accepting a conclusion he didn't like. After that, I made changes, small ones. I hired help of my choosing. I reorganized my accounts. I updated documents, not out of spite, but clarity. I didn't cut anyone off. I simply removed access. The house grew quieter, not lonely, just settled. I spent mornings the way I wanted. Afternoons walking slowly, noticing things again. Evenings with a book or a radio playing low. Sometimes I thought about the inheritance, not the money, the intention. My husband had left me something far more valuable than assets. He left me authority over my own life. The children reached out eventually. Carefully. Respectfully. The tone had changed. They asked instead of told. Waited instead of assumed. That was the consequence. Not punishment. Adjustment. There were no apologies. I didn't need them. Because respect returned without being spoken. And that was enough. I still live in the same house. The one they thought was too much for me. It holds my life. Not just memories, but choice. Sometimes I sit in the evening light and think about how close I came to losing more than money. I could have lost myself. But I didn't. Because someone who loved me planned ahead. And because I learned that dignity doesn't announce itself. It waits. And when the moment comes, it doesn't argue. It simply stands.